Welcome to Post Break. My name is Chris Peterson. I'm an EP at Nice Shoes and board secretary at the Post New York Alliance. Today's topic is everything you need to know about how the New York State tax credit works. Now to introduce our moderator, she's the CEO of Trevana Post, a leading provider of financial services for feature films and TV series. She works with clients including Netflix, Amazon, Focus Features, and Disney. She's also the chair of the PNYA, and as such, has played a key role in lobbying for the 30% film and TV post-production incentive. This has created thousands of jobs and boosted the local economy. Please give a warm welcome to Yana Collins Lehman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to immediately introduce my panelists, and then I will cover the objectives of this post break. First, my good friend, Ben Adams, who is the head of production finance at Amazon MGM, but I met Ben when he was at Sony. So we've worked together for a really long time, and he knows everything you would ever hope to know about all things production finance and many other things as well. Also, my friend Mike Jackman, who is now EVP at Film Nation, but started out as a founding member of the Post Alliance. So Mike's also been in New York forever. He knows a lot about New York, a lot about filmmaking, about post-production, so very valuable panelists. Catherine Farrell is a post-production supervisor and visual effects producer here in New York. She's also been here for a long time, and at least my entire career. So thank you, esteemed panelists, for agreeing to be here. I am going to cover briefly the New York State production credit because there have been some major changes to it. The governor made some major changes, and then we sort of had this massive production shutdown. So what has happened is a lot of misinformation is in the universe, and I am hoping that if I explain it well to all of you here in the audience, that you will then be able to explain it to others, specifically people who are considering New York for post-production or production. And after I explain that, my panelists and I are just going to get into a conversation about, the panelists are actually applicants of the tax credit. So we're going to get into conversation with them about why they do and don't choose New York, how the tax credit does and does not move the needle for them, and what the motives really are for where you budget your production and your post. Okay, so that being said, let's breeze through this. We dropped into the chat, I believe, a link to just a clean summary of how the post-production tax credit works. The production credit is a $700 million allocation. The changes to it from years past are that what is now eligible for the credit is above the line, which means actors, directors, producers, and writers. That spend is now qualified for the tax incentive, for the production tax incentive. That's the major change. That, and they've changed the legislation a little so that you should be getting your tax credit back faster, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. So as we know, if something has qualified for the production credit, any post-production or visual effects done in New York qualifies. There's no threshold that needs to be made for post-production work done on a production that qualified for the production credit. If, however, you come to New York to do post-production only or visual effects and animation only, you have to meet a 75% threshold. What has changed about the post incentive in the new legislation is that we used to be a $25 million sub-allocation of the 700 million, and now we are a $45 million sub-allocation. So that's a lot for post. And that's a testament to how many jobs post-production in New York has created as a result of this program. That is why the Budget Office of New York rewarded us with 45 million. Also, the entire program, post-production, the whole film and television tax credit program has been extended through 2034. That's a huge deal because the governor used to just renew it for 3 years at a time, 3 years at a time, 3 years at a time. The fact that this governor renewed it for 10 years is major. That should give television series a lot of security to budget here and budget multiple seasons here. Again, I'm really keeping myself between the lines because any one of these sentences that I'm saying, we could have an entire panel on, but it would not be interesting to most of you. Okay, so projects that spend 75% of their qualified costs, not including visual effects. So when we're looking at qualified costs, it's really like two separate budgets. Everything in your post-production, not including visual effects, everything that qualifies, you have to do 75% of that. How that often shakes out is that an out-of-town director will want to do his director's cut somewhere else, and that's going to be the 25% of qualified spend that you've now done. That's bad spend, and so now you have to do everything else in New York. There's a little bit of flexibility there, but 75% of qualified costs in New York State, you're eligible for a 30% credit. So that's the other major change. It used to be 25%, and it got bumped back up to 30%. Big change. Okay. The visual effects animation credit, you can do your post somewhere else, you can do your production somewhere else, you can come to New York for only visual effects and animation, and you are eligible for a credit. If you spend, so projects that spend the lesser of 20% or $3 million of your visual effects animation budget in New York State qualify for a 30% credit. What is qualified is everything from storyboarding to the DI. All of that work in visual effects and animation is eligible for the credit. So the threshold is very easy to make. 20% is not very much of many budgets, or $3 million isn't very much if it's a giant visual effects budget. So that has been a very successful program. And finally, again, we really don't want to get so into this, but all of the above, if done upstate, is eligible for a 10% labor bump, meaning a 40% credit on labor, and a 5% bump for non-labor spend, meaning a 35% credit on non-labor. And the things that don't qualify for the credit, things that are ineligible, or as we call it in the game, neutral spend, are the composer fee, music licenses, stock footage, insurance, legal fees, and producers, directors, actors, and writers do not qualify for the post-only spend. That is pure, that change was only made in the production credit. I think that basically covers it. So, esteemed panelists, given that we have such a badass aggressive credit in this incredible state, what prevents you from budgeting post-production here? I'll call on you first, Ben Adams.
Well, we do frequently look at New York. I'd say, just about every movie, we coming down to the wire, we're trying to squeeze out an extra, 2%, 3%, which is millions of dollars sometimes. And, the question often comes up, where could we take post somewhere different? Or, a number of other things come up. But specifically looking at New York as a potential for post-production comes up frequently. The biggest hurdles to bringing a title to New York where it wasn't otherwise planned for would be obviously convincing the director to do post there. And unless the editor is a New York local, it's often, not always, but often quite difficult to convince an editor to go to New York. And then if you're able to there's a shortage of certain facilities, and I think others in the room could talk better about what facilities are available for us to use there. But looking solely at the spend that does attract New York credits solely for post-production, not vis effects, we often wind up pretty close to the 75%. And I think a lot of times it leaves us in a position of not wanting to take the risk of potentially tripping up and going over schedule elsewhere, with bad spend outside of New York and losing the credit altogether. And I think that, may be something that could be looked at in the future as a potential way of securing. I mean, I think, like you mentioned, for television shows, a greater allocation and a farther sunset make New York a better location for television shows, maybe something like that for features. There are territories, I'm thinking of Australian states, where although they give you a ceiling and a cap and for your state tax credit, but if you don't hit the floor that you needed to in order to achieve the maximum benefit, maybe your tax credit's deteriorated a bit, but you don't lose it completely. I mean, I think that might make people feel safer about bringing shows to New York, but
Interesting.
Certainly a handful of considerations.
Thanks for that. You reminded me of something that I didn't make clear. Something that is unique about New York's tax credit, I think really only New Mexico is the same, is that it is a fully refundable tax credit. So in other states, you have to sell the credit to a vendor with a giant tax liability in your state. So New Jersey, Connecticut, I kind of consider those our neighbors, but Louisiana, Atlanta, those are partially refundable. New York is entirely refundable, non-saleable, non-transferable. So if your entity doesn't have a tax liability in the state of New York, you receive an actual check from New York State, cash money, that you can also finance. It's a pretty valuable tool and unique. So that's another thing for any of you in sales that you want to drive home. The fully refundable part of it is actually quite rare. Mike, let's scooch over to you. You live here. It's greatly convenient, but you have to travel all over the world in your capacity as EVP overseeing all of your projects. From your perspective, so MGM, Amazon, they're doing behemoth productions. Film Nation is doing stuff more in the like 20 to 50, 20 to 60 range. Still, you're finding more value outside of New York. Can you just get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And Ben expressed it all very, very well. We have the same issues and same path in terms of figuring out New York. And we shoot in New York when we can. We've shot almost a movie a year here for 5 years. Our most recent one was now titled Babes, was called Untitled Pregnancy Project. So we're always trying to do it. The prime motivator from the producing point, and then we also did post, tends to be, is it shot here, and the actors, primary actors, is it set here, and are our main actors either here or happy to be here? Usually that's a yes. When it's not set here, obviously we shoot all over the place, and post-production specifically, it's all a math game, as Ben said. It's all about what can we afford. I think I mentioned to you in our talk earlier, we are finding Cannes sort of marked a real delineation in terms of what movies are selling for. And we found when we got back from Cannes, looking at all of the sales, international sales, smaller international sales, lack of any worldwide sales, we started reducing our budgets across the board, production and post and above the line, by roughly 40% in order to make the kind of independent films that we make work. So our range really, we do films as low as 5 million and under sometimes, and I would say at the moment I would have said 50 million is the top, and I would now say it's more like 40, simply because the numbers aren't working so well internationally. Even international distributors that we have traditionally been a layup, right? We can go, okay, we'll be able to sell this movie to Latin America for X. It's been so standard for so long, and all of a sudden we're getting a lot of pushback, we're getting handling, we're getting negotiating, much more than we've had. So you start with that framework where we are fighting for every dollar. I would love to post all the films in New York. I'm here. Most of our company is here. Out of 50 plus people, 40 of us are here. But it does wind up being two things: financial, even with the tax credit. So your rates are high. Living here is high, and that does wind up a thing. If your director doesn't live here, it's very, very hard to afford to bring the director here. And exactly as Ben said, if we want to do post here, or we have a director, say, who lives in LA and he wants to edit in LA, we can get nervous about, does that 25% threshold hold? So editing often goes longer. So you can't sit there and budget, okay, well, we got 12 weeks of director's cut, or 10 weeks, 11 weeks, whatever it's going to be. And then we come here and great, that's it. That math works. If that math is close, it's too hard to do it, because we're likely to lose that tax credit, because editorial tends to be the at least primary thing, that and maybe sometimes VFX that just run over.
Have you ever lost a tax credit?
Only no, we've actually never lost a tax credit. We've come very, very close. We've had to do some weird calculus on when we're shooting in the midst of something where we had like a week in Spain on a project that we shot in New York, and we were like, okay, we can't do a week in Spain. We can do 4 days in Spain. And literally we're going like, what do we do here? We're contracting, we're pulling days off. We're trying to figure out how to do it in New York. That was a bit stressful, but no, we have not ever lost the tax credit, but we've come close, and we've had to make a change in plans because we were getting too close.
But fairly, that is how an incentive is meant to work. An incentive is meant to work to make you make those hard decisions so you do more in New York. But I hear you guys both that
it prevents us from planning. So those
Right.
other things are great once we're here, and then okay, let's keep stuff here. But if you're making your plans and you can't plan to be in New York because you're too close,
yeah.
That then New York loses all of that work.
Talk to us about South Africa. Ben and Mike, you both mentioned that that's sort of like one of the most attractive places to site a production right now. Tell us why.
And Ben can follow up, I'm sure, more in more detail than I. We are currently, so I have a movie that we budgeted in 10 different countries, literally going, how do we make this work? We had a lot of time during the strike, so we're like, budgeting everywhere. And different types of movies obviously mean you're chasing a tax credit or a currency exchange in a different way. If you got a big above the line, you have to have something that's got enough above the line, the tax credit to make it valuable. But what we're finding is right now, though the currency is shifting against us, the US dollar against the rand in South Africa is incredibly strong, making it, even though they have a limited tax credit with a cap of only like less than $1.5 million, that it still makes it worthwhile, even with a pretty big above the line, it's still making it worthwhile to go there. I've got a $20 million movie and a 30-something million dollar movie, both of which that are going to shoot in South Africa.
Did you say the cap is 1.5 million, and you can't get any more than $1.5 million in credit?
Yeah, it's actually closer to 1.3, and it was 2.6, and they cut it in half. But it still makes sense because labor is so inexpensive and the dollar is so strong, and materials, supplies, locations, all that is inexpensive. Also, Austria and Germany have a very, very strong and interesting tax credit that we've been looking at. In some cases, you can get the tax credit in both places while you're shooting, and that is also a place where we consider post. We would not do post in South Africa. So shooting in South Africa still means post is wide open. And Australia is another place because the dollar is so strong, and almost 50% benefit, and they've got a strong tax credit that we've looked at in Latin America, which and Ben, you should pick up.
Anything to add, Ben?
No, I definitely agree. Post-production, not in South Africa, but and yeah, the exchange rate makes South Africa incredibly attractive for the right size show. We can't take a circus down there. It's got to be a film, 20 million, maybe a little bit bigger, not much bigger. The smaller the better, actually, especially with such a small cap. There's such a small tax credit that's capped. I think the other thing to consider, but like Mike said, it's only it's $1.3 million is all we're talking about in tax credit. So it moves the needle, but it's not something that's necessarily critical. But the DTI, the governing body that hands out the tax credits down there, has been less than easy to deal with over the past 5 years. So it makes that tax credit even less certain. And the requirements of the production services companies in South Africa have become more onerous, including, the companies that you use have to be owned by minorities in order for the spend to count, and a certain percentage of you have to have a certain percent spend to be owned by minority vendors, minority owned vendors, in order to get the tax credit. So there's a number of challenges in South Africa, but again, all of those outweighed by the weak rand, strong dollar, and general low cost of living there.
We're not even assuming the tax credit on. If we get it, great, but we're not even assuming it on the projects we're bringing there. It still works.
Because net, it's still more bang for your buck.
But again, that still leaves post wide open.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, Catherine, you can go ahead and unmute because you're not getting off the hook with nodding and waving in this panel. Okay, so as someone who has done a ton of post-production in New York, I feel like you are uniquely positioned to kind of review in your mind, say, your last 10 projects in New York. What have been the pain points? What have been the points that make you, when you're looking at a post budget for like the next show, be like, oh, okay, this is going to be a challenge. Like, I want to do this in New York, but these are the pieces that are particularly challenging and potentially difficult to convince studios to schedule New York.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between Mike and Ben and I is usually by the time it gets to me, they're either definitely planning to do it in New York or they're leaning pretty heavily towards doing it in New York. There's still work to be done and budgeting to be done, but either the director's here and knows he wants to do post here, or they've crunched some preliminary numbers and they know it's probably going to go for New York for some reason. So mine is less financial, although that's always a piece of it, and more about kind of resource availability. And the tough thing about New York, and it's hard to remember this because we're coming out of 6 months of some really lean times, some of us. So it's hard to remember that most of the time in New York before that, with the exception of COVID in the middle of there, also, New York is kind of still a small town when it comes to facilities and rooms and big finishing capabilities and certain key crew. So when New York is kind of at max capacity, which we all always want it to be because we live here and we want it to be at max capacity all the time. Like, the best case scenario is that we're all turning down jobs constantly. But I think when a movie comes to me and says, okay, we want to post there in June through December of next year, and I know that Disney's bringing in a movie at the same time, or I know that there's a big visual effects movie, so I can't get that guy to visual effects supervise or produce, that's when you're like, oof, we are kind of, our bench is not super deep. It could be deeper. We have awesome people, but they work a lot, and yay for them. But I think when you want New York to staff up, it we do hit a wall at a certain point when it comes to crew. And that's the bummer, because I think in recent years, we've seen more LA or London or whatever influx of crew, especially editors, because you can make the argument, oh, well, everyone in New York is working. And that's tough, because again, yay that everyone in New York is working, but surely we could be doing something there's more people here who want to be editors. So how do we kind of grow that bench so that we never don't have a visual effects producer, and we never don't have a great sound, supervisor here in New York who's based here, rather than kind of the 10 who are on everybody's, first call list when a big-ish movie comes in. And kind of the same thing applies, I think, for facilities. And, every project is different in terms of what either the studio expectation is or what the director or showrunner expectation is. But since I deal mostly in features, most of the people I work with, they want a big mix stage and they want kind of A-list DI facility. So we certainly have those in New York, but we don't have 10 of them. And I think when the ones that are the ones that everybody knows are booked, it gets tough. It gets tough to convince a director who has maybe only finished on a big LA mix stage to finish on something that just is physically smaller. It still sounds awesome. It's a great room, but it's not as big. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And that's the first thing where I think someone will come in and be like, I gotta hear it. This is going to be theatrical. I gotta hear it in a big room. And again, I know that we're all leaning more towards streaming, and there's all sorts of scenarios where you don't care how big your room is, and that is great. And we have that too. But I do think we have a dearth of kind of, big classic theatrical rooms, and when they're booked, they're booked.
Right. Ben?
I was just wondering, because I think it'd be interesting to hear from Catherine. Other than the big scoring stages, the big sound, the mixing stages. I mean, and I know that we've brought mixers in, Academy Award winning mixers or big mixers in from Los Angeles, so that's helpful sometimes. But when it comes to scoring, and I've heard many times over that there are only three scoring facilities in the world, I guess, that many filmmakers will score on. The Streisand at Sony, you could tell me better what the other two are, but the dust in the room is, lucky, do you hear any of that? Do you have any complaints of that? I haven't, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, the scoring thing is a slightly more complicated one, because it's not just about what a composer wants. It's so often tied into the AFFM of it all. And if a production is kind of going that route, I find that's always question number one: are we union musicians? And if we are, and New York is an option, then you almost kind of it's tough, because there's kind of two places in New York to do a big score, and both of them have great sound if you can align the stars and get in there and use them at the exact time that you want to use them, which is tricky, because neither one of them are the Barbra Streisand stage, which is built solely to score motion pictures, right? These are places in New York. And again, I'm not trying to be cagey.
What are they?
Domena Center and Manhattan Center.
Like Hammerstein and Domena Center.
Exactly. Great rooms. Everyone there is great. The rooms sound great, but they do other stuff, right? They've got orchestras rehearsing. They've got their event venues. They're all sorts of stuff. More power to them. They get a lot more money that way. So when you want to book out, 10 days of scoring 6 months in advance, and full well that those scoring dates aren't going to hold and they're going to shift in either direction, it's just tricky, because it's not always a model that they're used to. I've recorded at both of them, and again, it's no disparagement towards them. It's just a slightly different business model than somewhere out in LA, where they're used to day in and day out everything's shifting around. Or you call Abbey Road and they get it. You're gonna put 3 months on hold 2 years in advance, and you'll use 3 days somewhere in there. And that's the nature of the beast. And New York is just not quite. Again, it's just not quite as elastic. It's tricky for I think for New York to be as flexible as as certainly as LA, but even in some respects London, because we're just smaller in that respect. And
What's
it's
the
tough,
third
you
one?
know,
The Barbra Streisand, the Abbey Road, and what's the third magical
probably
scoring stage?
Air. I would imagine
Air,
it's
yeah.
Air in London.
And following
Um,
along, honestly, what Catherine was saying, not just for music, but I am finding when we are here in post, and any schedule change now can become a huge problem. And again, it's great that we're so busy, but I think we have to grow to support how busy we are in non-strike, non-COVID times, because I have, for the first time, have been in a situation where I've had to delay delivery by a month or more because our schedule changed. We can't get on a mixing stage morning, noon, night, weekends, no matter what we want to spend. And now that just costs money. If we're not delivering, we're not getting the MGs paid to us. We're literally just waiting, which is really hard, which also is frustrating too, because, when you're making decisions that, few percentage points of your budget matter, where you go, where you shoot, what you do, how much you pay everybody, and then you sit there and burn dollars because you can't get back on the mixing stage because your date changed. That's tough too. And it makes people nervous in making the plan to be here.
And especially if budgets, well, you said it, your budgets are decreasing. And so that's going to mean every dollar has to be stretched, and you're not going to have that kind of time.
Yep. And to be fair, we will budget here, and I know we all want to be here, and we'll budget here when we can budget here, and even for comparison. And sometimes if it's close, we can find those dollars. But when it's a post-only thing, especially, a lot of that, as we mentioned at the outset, gets dictated by where does the director live, and can we afford to work there? And if we can't, if it's going to be, say, LA and somewhere for the rest of the finishing, where is that somewhere? And sometimes I've done that in New York. A lot of times I've done that up in Montreal, because where I would be straining to either worry about the 75% threshold or make the numbers work in New York, I can be much more relaxed about not having to worry about the threshold in Montreal or Toronto or wherever you're going, and and the numbers are generally a little easier, both because of the tax credit, which is it's probably comparable ultimately, though VFX is higher, but also the currency exchange adds value to that as well. So if it's if I can do that means I'm not here and I'm not in my backyard. Most of my execs can't go sitting on the mixing stage, and it'd be better to be closer, but these things turn on a dime.
So this is all really great information. I think an informed populace is a powerful one. So those of you on this call whose job it is to convince productions to come to New York, to come to your facilities, now you hear where the pain points are. But we also heard, I think something that's a great sales point, which is, yes, South Africa is cheap, but you cap at 1.5 million or 1.3 million or whatever that is. New York has no cap, which is crazy, because it's cash money. Like, it's $700 million that New York has actually allocated out of its budget. That's very different from New Jersey, which is 700 million, but $0 of its budget. No money comes out of the New Jersey state budget. So anyway, that's very interesting. And I also think, let's go back in time in history. If some of you on this call might remember this, when Sound One closed. And that was a moment in our history where a lot of people were like, we're done, because now we have no giant, Sound One was considered this giant 12-channel analog, only big movies will only go to Sound One. And a lot of people, really thought that was the end. And it wasn't. We pivoted, we built stages, shows still came here. I think New York's reputation for being, fast and scrappy and small, I think that has changed somewhat. It's still there, but I do think that we've gotten a little bigger, and we just have more room to grow. I think that these are really interesting I like to hear like a laundry list of if from a finance exec's perspective, we had the perfect credit, it would be, you know, X, Y, and Z. And I've heard you, and those are impossible changes, but you know, Mike, you and I can head up to Albany and see if we can get it to be like a 65% threshold, but
Let's
unlikely.
let's do it. Though I mean, there are some things. Again, I think Ben had a smart idea about you know, if you hit that, if you miss that 25% threshold or 75% threshold, is there either, you know, is there a path so it's not completely gone? Would be an interesting thing to talk about. Maybe it's reduced, but you know, that could ease some of the stress. I also think, you know, there are some people that you're going to wind up bringing or needing to bring to New York. And I know, you know, travel and living is never, you know, hotels are never included, but it's one of those things where that's something to think about, whether there can be some number of allocations. Most places that do tax incentives allow some number of HODs to be, you know, to be brought. They know that, you know, people are going to have to be brought from elsewhere. We allow that obviously because if they're used and consumed, paid here, we get the tax credit on them. But the hotel money especially is, you know, it's a number. It factors into those little bits of calculations. And if you've got two people or you got a director and an editor that you want to bring over here for 3 or 4 months, you're going to be flying them back and forth a lot. But at least if you could have the hotel, which is money that goes to New York, and in fact, a lot of incentives are financed off of like how many room nights does, like, you know, does the tourist department have? You know, that may also be a small tweak that could help with the numbers, because it also adds to qualified spend in New York.
What
So,
Mike is referring to here, for anybody who isn't aware, is that New York does not give an incentive on travel and living for when you fly an editor or house a director or a composer. You know, their labor, well, not composer, but the editor's labor is qualified for the incentive, but the Airbnb you're renting for him or putting him up at the Four Seasons, like that cost is not, the credit is not given on that. And the reason for that is because we don't want to incentivize productions to bring labor from out of state. We want them to use in-state labor. But the point is well taken that when you don't have the labor available in the state, and you know, you are spending money in New York, should the hotels qualify? It's a fair question, something we'll probably have to look at in the future. I mean, I think what's happened here is that we have one of the most aggressive tax credit programs in the country, one of the most generous. It was passed in April of 2022, and then everything shut down. So we really had no time to see how it works, if these changes have suddenly, you know, benefited New York tremendously or not. But I will say that some reporting came out. The state commissions a report every year. They finally changed companies that does the report to a better company. And it showed what I knew to be true the whole time, is that post-production is crushing it, is killing it, is bringing so much money to the state of New York, really massive money, so close to what production is doing that it really blew everybody at ESD away. So, and that was with the weaker credit. So I think that, you know, we're going to need a year or so to see what happens if the world goes back to normal. Now, before we start talking about all the hopeful things, and I swear we're getting there, we do have to talk about this, you know, Ben, what you talked about before, and this is just factual, so we just want to say it, like why studios might be holding on green lighting certain projects anywhere has to do with the pending IATSE negotiations. And so if you were saying that, then that has to be the case that I'm assuming every studio.
I think for sure. I think it's definitely consideration. I mean, and, you know, I think others brought up good points that, you know, the IATSE may not want to strike, but the Teamsters are in a good position and they have a lot of leverage to get out ahead of IATSE and potentially shut everything down. We're not moving without Teamsters. So I think that strike scares me more than anything else. And I'm not being advised of anything yet. I'm just sort of forecasting the future a little bit when we were riffing this morning. But after being down for over 120 days and with other agreements not yet finalized, there may be some delays in getting projects to green light. That said, we have theater, we have screens to fill, we have, theatrical releases, and there's definitely needs to be content produced. I think there are some studios that'll hold back, but others that will definitely move forward. They just won't have a choice. I think that'll become big.
I'm gonna answer Lucian's question to everyone because this is another thing that changed. So there was a backlog of tax credits, and it was taking a long time for applicants to get their certificates. They changed the legislation. So the legislation used to say that you received the credit for the allocation year +1. That means whatever year the state was allocating, taking the money from, and they sometimes were taking from future years. So you would get a certificate that said allocation year 2023, but you really couldn't submit that tax credit certificate until 2024. So you weren't getting your money for years. They changed that now. So it's just allocate. It's the year that the costs were incurred. That's the year that's going to be on your certificate. That means you're going to get your money faster. What, Mike?
It's the year that the costs were incurred, meaning
Yeah,
not as opposed to what they're allocating forward from. So
correct. That's right.
that's a huge difference.
It's a huge difference. So the money is definitely going to get there faster. I'm saying this to all you salespeople. Just get that out there. Plus, the state has been sitting there auditing tax credits for the last 120 days. So there isn't the same backlog. Stop it. Are you saying they haven't been doing that, Mike?
I'm sure they have.
They have. No,
Okay.
seriously, Tervana, you guys, my company is a post accounting company. We administrate these tax credits, and we've been shocked how fast the certificates have been getting back. It was like 18 months, and now it's like 6 months. We're all over here like celebrating, like, what? I just submitted that in September, and I already got the certificate. So that's real. That's a real thing. That's a law changed, and so you should tell everybody, get your money faster. And plus, we have a $700 million allocation, so that's a lot of. And that hasn't been touched, right? So like that's a lot of on-ramp to pull from. We're not going to be pulling from the future.
Have the limits have the limits per year, or at least the breakdown of whether it's 1, 2, or 3 years that you get paid out in, is that still, those still the same size?
Yes, they are.
But they are. Okay. So it's not a lump sum payout all at once. It's over 1, 2, or 3 years, depending on the size of the credit.
For those of you applying for monster credits, yes, they break it out over a couple of years. To wait a little.
Okay.
Got to keep it on your receivable.
Yeah.
Okay, well, does anybody else have any other questions?
Do we have, I do. Do we have is there any sort of reporting other than sort of what you're noticing that could help sell the speed at which the tax credit can come back now? Because there was a time just before, I guess it was before COVID, where, Film Nation, we were waiting 5 years for a tax credit on a project because allocation year was 3 years out. And then it was a year after that. And then we filed that year, and then you get it back the year after that, which we just, had a hard time affording to do, depending upon the structure of a loan or the financing. It would be great. Is ESD putting out any statistics of their own now about the pace of refund or the allocation, other than just saying, okay, it's now the year that you spend? I guess that may just be enough.
Saying that it's the year that you spend, not year that you spend or allocation year +1. So taking that out of the law, and that went into effect immediately. That is going to speed everything up. It just is. You're just going to get your money faster.
Yeah, by 2 years or more.
What?
By 2 years or more faster. So it's not.
Yeah, I mean, they really hurt us when we said this is the only entities that can afford our tax credit program are major studios that can just let these tax credits hang out on their receivables for years and years and years. You know, nobody taking out a loan and having to pay interest on this loan that they're not able to pay off for 5 years can make a movie here anymore. And we really made that point in our lobbying that like we're going to lose independent film production in New York altogether if we don't fix this. And there was all kinds of insane ideas about how to fix it, like indie buckets. And we went crazy with wild, complicated things. And then the governor's staff is really, really smart. And so they just changed the law because that's literally the fastest, cleanest way to make it change immediately. So we'll see. I mean, I'm expecting, again, it was very frustrating to have this very aggressive tax credit pass and then have no case studies to watch it work. So, you know, we've all sort of been in limbo this whole time. And so, you know, hopefully, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about some forecasts. Let's bust out our educated crystal balls, my panelists. And when would you anticipate that people will be getting calls for jobs? Like, when do you think people in New York will be working again? I think March, April, May, June.
I mean, from our perspective, forgetting where we're shooting, because there's lots of people who I'm sure are going to be shooting in New York. We are, you know, trying to get into pre-production, if not already, then by the first of the year. So that means we're shooting, you know, March, April, and we're going into post by May on a number of projects. And I suspect, I know there are people who are prepping now. I was talking to somebody, I mean, I think shows are already shooting now. I mean, some series are back into production. There are people who were back into production, I think the next morning that after the, you know, strikes settled, the Writers Guild strike settled. And so I think March is pretty reasonable, maybe on the early side, but I think it's going to get I suspect it's going to get very busy certainly by the middle of next year, and it should be ramping up by Q1, end of Q1, because it's we're all trying to make up for lost time. We've got 4 films that we're supposed to shoot last year. We're shoving them right into the beginning of this coming year, and then there's others on the tail of that, and we're certainly not alone with that. I mean, Catherine, I know what you're seeing, and Ben, I'm sure you guys are doing the same.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. I mean, I think the movies that I'm hearing of are on that side, of the faster ones that were kind of maybe had already started prep or you know, had already had their eye on a start date, are looking at hopefully like a January, February shoot start. So I think that like late spring for people who are starting in post feels right. This is not part of what you're asking, Yana, but I'm always curious, you know, it was a little bit this way after COVID, but this will be an interesting experiment to see if and when kind of the freight train of work comes back to New York City, which it will. We know that it will be here soon, whether it's April or June. I'll be curious to see. I know that everyone I'm hearing on the studio side is lamenting the potential, best way to say it, potential salary gouging on the crew side, who are, you know, hoping that they can make up a little bit of lost time by a massive amount of work coming to town, and get a little bit more, get a little bit of a bump on their salary. And the studios, I feel like, are trying to bring numbers down from where they might have been previously, and try and, you know, get things done for cheaper. So I'm always interested to see how that plays out, because I think there's 2 very different ways of thinking. Whereas before it was a little bit like, check the box, here's the rate, okay, keep moving. I think people on the crew side are really hurting, and I think people on the studio side are really strapped. So let's see how that goes. A little bit of thunder.
You're anticipating some tension where facilities are going to try to make up some dough, raise their prices, and
I mean, I've heard
is going to demand humongous salaries to make up for what they've lost. And that's going to cause a lot of tension because that's not going to be accommodated for in the budgets.
Well, so like the blessing and the curse of New York, as we've talked about earlier, is like it's finite. It's sort of finite, and we're hoping that it can become more elastic. But right now, it's like kind of is what it is. And the strike, the strike, I think, we'll start to see that some of the facilities and the crew members who didn't have a year of savings or who didn't have the ability to kind of just weather through a big shutdown of clients might have closed. So we might even be dealing with less choices in New York than we were 6 months ago in terms of vendors and in terms of crew. And if that's the case, the people who are left, who are in demand, I hope they get more money. But as someone who's at least moderately responsible for the budget, that's going to be hard because there won't be more money to give them.
Right.
So I think it'll be tough. I'm already hearing stories of production, people who did budgets pre-strike that they've had to completely revisit because they went back to people who they thought they had secured for the production, and now they're like, 5 movies are coming to town, and I'm going with the one who's going to pay me the most. So the quote that I gave you 6 months ago when I was happy to work on your movie, well, my rate's now gone up $500 a week because 4 people want me and I can. And that has nothing to do with kind of scale or kind of negotiations or IATSE or anything like that. It just has to do with the people who are in the most demand might be able to flex a little bit. And that gets tricky because I feel like New York actually doesn't flex as much because we're so scrappy. And I feel like our mentality for so long was like, I'll take it. I'll just take it. Great.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, I derailed us as usual.
No, I think that's fair. I think it's likely. I mean, I haven't heard of any facilities shutting down, blessedly. I know, like, as a facility, I've tried to, be accommodating. Trevani used to have a super hardcore rule about we don't go on hiatus. If you go on hiatus, it's not our fault. And we've changed that because we understand it's like not even the studio's fault sometimes that they have to go on hiatus. Sometimes it's a visual effects facility's fault that the studio has to go on hiatus. And so, we have the flexibility to be accommodating. But I get that. That's tough. I want to answer Charlie's question. What are our thoughts about the impact of the New Jersey incentive? It seems they want to increase post-production capability there. I think, they're probably about 20 years away from having a post-production infrastructure there, and I welcome them. And I would say, those of you who have infrastructure in New York, you should definitely take a look at New Jersey because that's the fastest way to build a New Jersey infrastructure. I don't believe it would compete with New York. I think it would be, and again, the New Jersey tax credit is not refundable. The New Jersey tax credit, talk about waiting a while to get your money. Wait to get your certificate, then wait for your meeting with Walmart or Dr. Pepper so that you can sell your certificate for 82 cents on the dollar. Like, that's not all that attractive to all that many people. However, they do incentivize reality, like Jersey Shore Christmas special. So, but I do not feel that New Jersey's post-production infrastructure will compete with New York for a good 10, 15, 20 years, unless New York facilities get out there and start building stuff.
I think the other thing about Jersey is where in Jersey. You know what I mean? New York.
Exactly.
Manhattan is Manhattan, and you can get to Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens and those stages, but we're pretty centered here. Honestly, we could use some mixing stages, maybe in a little outside of Manhattan, so they could be bigger. But where in New Jersey? It's like
I would love for someone to do an infographic of like where post-production in New York was, like, and where it moved, and it's very methodical. So like to cross the Hudson over to Jersey City when it wouldn't even cross the East River to do shit in Brooklyn, I'm not worried.
Yeah, no, I think I'm not either. Production wise,
Pippin Studios
will go everywhere.
Pippin Studios is trying. They have a beautiful facility. Nobody goes there.
Yeah.
But
and then the other thing that we touched upon, and Catherine talked about at the outset, the small townness of New York. I mean, that is a thing that has to be looked at by facilities here. Many of the people on this call and on the Zoom, and so and VFX becomes, another area. It's like, it can be hard to piece together a large enough VFX team amongst multiple facilities to handle all the work and then therefore benefit from the tax credit in New York when you have a large VFX job. And then what we've also found is for the smaller VFX jobs or even medium size, when we were busy as we were not that long ago, it was too busy. We couldn't, I couldn't get anyone's attention of, great VFX supervisors. I couldn't get one for this job or the other job, and wound up kind of scratching my head and going, all right, well, even if I'm posting in New York, I'll do VFX elsewhere. And I've done that. I've had to do that on a number of occasions where I've kicked stuff off to Australia, where they fund their own tax credit. So you can get a 40 or 50% VFX funded tax credit. They just give you a discount, and then the dollar's strong. And I've done that. I've done that up in Canada with some similar results. I've done that in India. You go all over the place, not necessarily because I didn't want to do it here, but I couldn't get anybody to do the work here.
Right. So to sum up, for those of you who want to go get massive loans, we need a couple of giant mixing stages, a couple of gigantic scoring stages that solely do scoring for music. They don't do other things. And about 600 VFX artists and maybe 50 supervisors. How long does it take to go from being an artist to a supervisor? Like 10 years?
There's
So we
no
gotta get
clear
going.
path.
There
We also need like a farm team system. I feel like actually post supervising has been better about that. I feel like post supervisors, we had coordinators and we kind of we've grown our bench. There are post supervisors in town now, and that's awesome. There aren't some other things. So sound and visual effects, grow your departments.
Let's go. We have our marching orders. We're going to do it. Does anybody have any final questions that have not been answered, or do my esteemed panelists want to make any closing remarks before we end?
Well, I'm happy to say, as I said at the outset, I would love to work in New York. It's where I live. It's where I work. And anytime I get to work here, I'm working with people that I find somebody or a half a dozen people that I've known for decades. And so it's the most fun, and there's tremendous talent here. So it's none of this is about talent and ability. We've got amazing artists and technicians, and we need more, so that, and we need a few, maybe some tweaks that give us a little more flexibility and the ability to work here. And we'll also see how the tax credit impacts this over time, because I think it will. But I think we need that farm team.
We don't have the most talent, but we do have the best talent here in New York, I must say.
I'd echo a lot of what Mike said, other than, of course, my residency is California, but I think throughout my career, it's always been a treat to come to New York. Everyone, if they're not going to Paris, they're quite happy to go to New York. And thanks to everyone on the call who's been, part of that. Yana, I know that there's probably a whole lot of others on here too, but I don't think it'd be possible for us to bring anywhere near as much work to New York without your involvement. So that's a big deal. Kudos.
Here, here.
Final words, Catherine?
Oh no, I got nothing.
All right, great.
I also want to say hi. I see a lot of familiar faces and people that I've also known for a very long time. Really, thank you all for joining the panel. It's great to see your names and faces, and hope this was interesting. And thank you, Yana, for organizing it, and for Travana for overseeing it through the Post New York Alliance.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank all of you. Happy holidays to all of you. And as ever, if there are any questions that we didn't cover, you have my phone number, you have my email, yana@travana.com. Your clients can call me. I'm happy to answer any and all tax credit questions to help you close or sell or do anything. So again, New York really is the best. And thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Thank you, Yana.
Thank you.